With your host, Andrew Donaldson. This is Heard Tell.
Welcome back to Heard Tell. Okay, new face. Love getting new contributors on, but he's from an old group of friends. He's a Young Voices contributor. He's up in Michigan at the University of Michigan at Ann Arbor, although for the purposes of this conversation, we will not hold that against him because it ain't his fault that Rich Rod went up there. Kareem Rafai, how are you, my friend? Thank you so much for joining the program.
I'm good. How are you? Thank you so much for having me.
I'm good. I wish we didn't have to talk about this kind of a topic, but we do because it's the kind of world we live in. You're writing in the Detroit News about it. I want to preface it with this because you've already wrote this piece a few days ago. Just in the few days since you read it, it's all over the news. Protests, dissidents, crackdowns on protests, how authoritative regimes like China, like Vladimir Putin, like others, are extending their reach into Western nations to try to cut down on dissent. This is something, obviously, you probably started researching this a week or two ago. This is something that's going to accelerate in the coming weeks, I think. Is that how it feels to you too?
For certain, yeah. And like I say in the piece, we're all aware that these regimes crack down on dissent within their own borders. But I really wanted to call attention to kind of this growing phenomenon of what Drew, the guy I interviewed, and I call the export of repression abroad.
That's a great term. You should trademark that real quick or maybe get the domain name for it because that's exactly what they're doing. We throw around terms like colonialism and imperialism, but then when you look at China, well, they're being imperialistic about things, but they're being imperialistic about repression and about controlling speech and narratives and things like this. That's part of what you're getting at here in the bigger picture before we get into the specifics of this piece. In the modern world with modern technology, they have to fight with information. They're trying to sequester free speech. That's nothing new in history, but it's very different in the modern age. And they're not just content to do it in their own countries. They're going worldwide with it.
Absolutely.
What's the first thing you hit on when you went to look at this? I want you to tell us the story because I think things like this, we get a little buzzwordy on them sometimes. Of course, the old thing about, a million people's a statistic, one man's a tragedy. You highlight this guy in England, and he was protesting, and he got snatched up. But it's also indicative of this tactic that's been used. Tell us the story of this guy and why you started out with it to bring attention to this issue.
For sure. So his name is Drew Pavlou. He is an Australian pro-democracy activist. He's made headlines for a couple of years now. Famously, he was removed from Wimbledon after holding up a sign, I believe, that said, "Where is Peng Shuai?" That famous Chinese tennis player who lodged sexual assault allegations at a top CCP official. So he's been in the public eye for a while now, and I've gotten to know him recently pretty intimately. And a few months ago now, or a couple of weeks ago, he was protesting in front of the Chinese embassy in London. And essentially what happened was a fake bomb threat under his name was emailed to the embassy. The embassy called the police. He was arrested. He was in, jail for 24 hours, like no access to consular assistance. He was in a whole bunch of legal trouble. The authorities were not, believing his story that this was a fake threat. He was essentially trapped in London for almost a month because of court dates. He was told, if he left the country, he may be arrested. And all of this just sparking from him standing outside an embassy with a couple of flags, ended up with him being arrested for threatening to commit a terroristic act.
And the thing about this is, and as you detailed it, the reason we know this was probably a setup is because the Chinese officials, the CCP and their intelligence and their security apparatus, they've targeted him before. So the fact that he was just standing out there, they knew well and good who this guy was, and they made sure it was a very specific, oh, this is the guy that did that, right?
Absolutely. And the exact same thing happened to him again this week in Australia, another fake bomb threat under his name. But now finally, authorities have caught on that this is, a targeted campaign against him. So he's not facing really any legal trouble from what I know now. But yeah, it just continues.
The thing about this is almost like the swatting tactic we've seen in American domestic politics. But on an international level, this has extreme consequences. Like you said, he's an Australian, so he's a Commonwealth guy. He should be able to travel. This could prevent him from traveling. This is very much a way of trying to tap down dissent, because the reason they go after a high-profile dissenter like him is because if you can get him, then the rest are quiet. We just had on our program talking about Hong Kong with Francis Wei, and then they're like, look, when they took out the top 50 or 60 organizers, all the protests in Hong Kong stopped. This is a pattern. This is something the Chinese Communist Party has down to a science. They know what they're doing this, and the pattern is something we should see to see how it's reaching out worldwide, and you touch on that.
Absolutely. Like you mentioned with Hong Kong, diaspora communities have been targeted for a really long time now. Uyghurs, Hong Kongers, Taiwanese people, especially on college campuses too. There's, the CSSA, which is the Chinese Student Scholars Association, which, there's a bunch of accusations that the Chinese government uses that organization on campuses to spy on dissent from students. So Drew kind of also drew that to my attention as well, that a lot of the diaspora communities in the UK and in Australia have been constant targets by the CCP, even once they've left China's borders.
And what does he say when you talk to him? Again, put a personal face on this, because we understand the geopolitics of it. We understand the human rights issue part of it. Well, most people that are functional adults that aren't wicked understand it. There's some people in the world that don't. When you're talking to him, what comes across? Like, what drives people to keep dissenting like this? Is it the people he knows personally? Is it just the wrongness of it? When you're talking to somebody like that one-on-one, not through a news story, not through a written piece, not through propaganda videos and YouTube, both for and against, what is it that comes across?
Yeah, like you mentioned, he's made a lot of close connections with people from those diaspora communities. And when you talk to them and you hear their stories, it's impossible not to empathize. As a Syrian too, like, I'm a part of a diaspora community from an authoritarian country. And when I tell my story to people who are not Syrian, I see that kind of empathy in Drew as well, even though he's not Chinese and he's, from Australia, born and raised, from what I know. You can just really tell he has a lot of empathy, and he's heard a lot of personal stories from, Tibetans and Uyghurs, etc.
Let me ask you about that, because, Syria and Assad and Russia and ISIS, that was just a brutal mix of basically all the world's worst actors converging, and the Syrian people ended up paying a heavy, heavy price, a massive price in death in wiped out cities. We'll probably never know the actual death toll. When you're talking to somebody who maybe doesn't follow politics, especially world politics, and doesn't even know something like that even exists, how's it hit you? Do you feel do you just not want to talk about it? Do you feel a responsibility as somebody in a diaspora community of, I need to explain to them why this is so important? Talk about that, because I've talked to so many people in these kind of communities. We've had them on the show before, and they all talk about it. It's like, this isn't really what I want, but I feel a burden about this sort of thing. I feel like I'm representative of it. How do you carry that burden, and do you feel it?
I definitely feel like I have an obligation to speak up for people in Syria who never had the chance to, especially for my family as well. They've gone through a lot. And, I was privileged enough to be born in the United States. So it's kind of like a survivor's guilt kind of thing. If my parents didn't choose to immigrate here, I probably would have been born in Aleppo, and who knows where I would be right now. So it does kind of come out of not only a feeling of obligation, but I want to share my story and the story of other Syrians and what they've gone through, because, my ultimate goal is to make sure that what happened in Syria doesn't happen ever again anywhere else. And that's why I have a lot of empathy, for these diaspora communities from China and from Taiwan and from Hong Kong, because, their plight it's different, but it's similar. This, reverberating effect of authoritarianism. Even when you're diaspora, it still affects you every single day. So
Yeah, and what you're saying about survivor's guilt is the same thing a lot of those people have said when we've interviewed them and talked to them, or even talked to them offline, just prepping. Obviously, Syria is a terrible thing. When you see that's kind of the end game of it, though, where you just have leveled, literally, you talk about Aleppo, like just rubble for most of it, unfortunately. Talk about, for somebody who just can't draw the line, no matter how you explain it to them, is like the reason you have to stand up to a bomb threat in London, the reason you have to stand up to Putin in Ukraine before it gets to that shooting war, before you get to tens of thousands of dead, before you get to a level cities, this quieting of dissent is how that starts. You draw that straight line in your advocacy. You've done it on your Twitter account. You do it in this piece. But just explain to people that's why this is so important, because that is how, that crushing of dissent is what leads to those level cities every single time.
absolutely, yeah. It's not always the most attractive and appealing thing to, call out foreign human rights abuse when it's not trendy. You know what I mean? So Ukrainian activists have been talking about Ukraine since the annexation of Crimea, and they've been largely ignored. They've been warning us about Putin for years. Syrian activists, the exact same thing. We've been warning about Russia for years, largely ignored. And until Russia actually mobilizes a full invasion of a European country is when it becomes trendy and sexy to talk about, oh, Russia is so bad, we need to do something about Russia, et cetera, et cetera. When in reality, if we had jumped to action like we should have years ago, we wouldn't be at the place where we are today, with entire cities in Ukraine and Syria being leveled and thousands, tens of thousands of people being dead.
Yeah. Unfortunately, you're correct. Kareem Rafai joining us on Heard Tell. We're going to take a quick commercial break. We come back. There's more in this piece. He talks about Iran. We're going to talk some more about China. We're going to talk some more about dissidents and Russia. All three of those heavily in the news cycle right now. We're going to work through them with our friend Raheem Jig, Young Voices contributor. Great conversation, deep conversation, but an important one to have. Heard Tell continues right after this. Welcome back to Heard Tell, continuing our conversation with Kareem Rafai. He's up in Michigan right now, but he's talking about dissent, talking about authoritarianism, talking about protesting them and the very real cost that protest can have. On that vein, we've got it right in the news right now as we're speaking, really, in Iran. We have massive protests, the death of a woman at the hands of the morality police, they call it. She died in custody, and especially the women and others are protesting back. They're getting killed in the streets for it. We've seen this before in 2019. We've seen it before other times in Iran where they'll do this really brutal crackdown. When you're talking about dissent and how important it is and protesting, how's it hit when you see something like this? Because, let's be honest here. Sometimes protesting gets a little performative, and there's actually a protesting industry. But when you see this kind of bravery, women ripping off their hijabs and cutting their hair in public and this sort of thing, boy, that really hits home on how important this stuff is to me. How's it hit with you, though?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, they are the peak of bravery. People standing up in regimes as repressive as Iran's and, openly flouting, the most repressive laws. It really is inspiring. And that's why in this article, I talked to Drew specifically about Iran and the silencing of dissent in Iran and abroad. And the case of Masih Alinejad, who is a Iranian women's rights activist here in the US, who faced not even her first assassination attempt a couple of weeks ago. I mean, it really has come full circle that, just a couple of weeks after the assassination attempt of Masih Alinejad and also Salman Rushdie, that we have these mass protests in Tehran.
compare and contrast those two because hers you heard almost nothing about. And I watch a lot of news and I heard nothing about it. Rushdie obviously got international headlines. Of course, he's been under a Fatah for 40 years now. So that one got a lot of headlines. Why do you think certain ones of those hit the headlines and certain one of them don't? Now, also, Rushdie's was on video, so that's part of it, to be fair. And he's a much higher profile. But the core problem, what the Iranian regime was trying to do there, it's the same thing, isn't it?
Exactly. So it doesn't matter how high of a profile the person is. We need to be paying attention to every act of Iranian-sponsored terror on our soil, whether it be a famous author like Rushdie or a prominent activist like Masih Ali-Najad. We need to be paying attention to Iran's actions on our own soil. It's a violation of our sovereignty. It's a violation of our freedoms. And it's honestly egregious that an Iranian American activist, she, I believe, is an American citizen, is at threat of being gunned down in her own home in New York because she said something negative about a regime thousands of miles away.
Now, to come back to China for a minute, we know Vladimir Putin has executed and tried to assassinate people through various poisonings and other methods. We know the Iranians have been doing it for decades. The Chinese are more subtle about this, but it's no less wicked and evil what they're trying to do with dissent. Their methods are different. Like, Russia invaded Ukraine. China's trying to do this, economically and influence-wise. They don't really want a shooting war. They because it's bad for business. But the spirit of authoritarianism, the same problem, the same human rights issues, it's all there. It's just wearing a different coat and using a different method, isn't it?
Absolutely. You're right. It's a lot more covert on the end of China. I think the bomb threat, the faux bomb threat in the case of Drew Pavlou is, one of the more open flouting of their anti-democratic activities abroad. But like I talked to Drew, most of their action is covert. So they have, people on college campuses reporting to them about Chinese students who are, talking about Tiananmen Square or criticizing the CCP. They have professors we've seen in the past few years that are conducting academic espionage. They're a lot more covert about it. They're not like Iran sending assassins to people's doors in New York City.
Now, you talked about talking to Drew about his struggle. You also talked to a Chinese-Australian dissident, Vicky. I'll let you pronounce the name because I'll butcher it too, who's been the subject of Chinese state media smear campaign and serial harassment. I got to imagine, although the case is different and the methods are a little different, boy, it sure sounds like a lot of the same things because the way you harass and crush dissent is pretty universal, isn't it? Tell us about her story like you did with Drew. Put a human face on that one.
I didn't speak with Vicky, but Drew is a close friend of hers. She's a pretty prominent anti-CCP activist who has been relentlessly harassed by agents of the CCP. Her personal text messages being publicized on Chinese social media, her personal devices being hacked, just systematic harassment. There's no other way to describe it. I can't even imagine being in the situation that she's been in. But yeah, her story is just one of many that Drew shared with me of Chinese diaspora communities and Chinese dissidents being relentlessly targeted by the CCP apparatus abroad.
Yeah, you also made a point to kind of draw these desperate threads together. The wannabe assassins of Rushdie and Ali-Najad, they're going to be brought to justice because they were caught. They were literally caught in the act. But when it's the CCP calling it a bomb threat, when it's them crushing dissent, when it's them using things like diplomatic immunity to cover their actions in foreign countries, we're not going to get a quick, clean justice in that way. So how do you fight back against it?
Absolutely. And I draw this, I draw attention to that in the piece because we need to start holding these regimes accountable for crimes they're committing essentially on our soil and against our own citizens. It's not enough to just prosecute their agents. We also need to start holding the governments that are the ones funding and sending these people out to harass American and Western citizens. That needs to be something that we peg to our diplomacy. How are we going to negotiate deals with someone like, Raisi in Iran when he's sending assassins to kill random American citizens. It's absurd.
Yeah, and the reason we don't do that is because, Iran is obviously a player in the Middle East trying to always keep that delicate balance going. We know the issues with them in Israel. We know the issues with them and the Saudis. It's a complicated thing. So that balance buys them a lot of their human rights violations. China buys theirs economically. People are afraid to upset. They want to do business with China, so they buy theirs economically. You just mentioned the president of Iran. We just had the incident in New York City. Christina Amanpour, the well-known reporter, refused to wear a headscarf to interview, and he stormed off mad and refused to do it, basically, or his staff did. That doesn't sound like a big protest compared to the economic stuff and the human rights stuff and peace in the Middle East. But what you're saying, little things like that publicly to leaders that make them lose face, which is something they do care about, I think that does matter. How does it land with you, though?
Absolutely. I'm more enthusiastic than anyone to see the now mainstreamed upheaval against the Iranian government right now in the US. And I hope it lasts because we can't go weak. There's no more time for weakness. Too many people have died at the hands of the Iranian regime for us to take a step back and give them a boatload of concessions. So seeing this mainstreamed upheaval against not only Raisi, but the government of Iran over what's been going on in the past week, it's really great to see.
Kareem Rafai joining us. Now, you've gotten to talk to dissidents like Drew. You've got a little bit of a network. You're from a diasporic community. Not everybody listening to that has those kind of connections. What can someone do to affect it just in their social media, in their conversations, in the discourse, in the way they talk about these things? Just kind of the average person who, doesn't have political connections and maybe doesn't think they have a dog in the fight other than maybe they do care about freedom. Tell them a few things they can do that actually affect change here. Is it in the way they talk? Is it following and platforming and echoing the dissidents that do get their message out? Give the normal folks a thing or two they can do, like on their social media, that would actually do some good here and not just yelling at the TV about how wrong it all is.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the number one thing that someone who is not intimately connected to these issues can do is to fight the apathy. And the way that you fight apathy is continuing to talk about the human rights abuses that are happening, continuing to platform dissidents and the people who actually are being intimately affected by these anti-democratic actors, and fighting against the kind of everyday apathy of, well, that's thousands of miles away, it doesn't affect me, because in reality, it does. Every time you go to the pump, and the price is above $4, you can point to, the instability that's been caused by Russia. It's an everyday thing. It's for everyone. So you may think that you don't have a dog in the fight, but in the end, you do. You may not be as intimately connected as someone, in Kiev or someone in Aleppo or someone in a diaspora community, but you are being affected by the actions of these regimes every single day. And you should be putting an effort to making sure other people know that too.
Yeah, that's really well put, my friend. Kareem Rafai joining us. We're going to have you back because these issues are universal. They're not going away. They look like they're accelerating in a lot of ways. But I also take some hope here because I think the reason some of this is accelerating is because I think some of these regimes are legitimately scared, especially Putin, especially the Iranian regime. China's not going anywhere, but they obviously have a long-term plan that they worry about it. So we have to have hope because if they're worried, that means that there's hope. Till we get you back, though, let folks know where they can follow you. We're going to link to this piece. It's a great piece. There's a lot of links inside the piece. Make sure you read those as well. Read it for yourself. Share it with folks. Make up your own mind. We'll link to that in the show notes. Let folks know where they can follow you and what you have going on until they see you the next time we get you on Heard Tell.
I'm at Kareem Rafai on Twitter and Instagram. That's Kareem, like the basketball player, Rifai.
Great information today. Important topic. Really enjoyed having you. We will have you back. Thank you so much for the time, my friend.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yes, sir. Welcome back to Heard Tell. Grace is joining us. Francis is joining us. They're both from the Dissident Project. Grace, real quick, we just heard her, more of her story and what's going on in Hong Kong. It's not just Hong Kong. We have multiple people in the Dissident Project from all over different parts of the world. The theme that goes across all of these, whether it's Venezuela, whether it's Hong Kong, whether it's North Korea, authoritative dictatorships who need power and they have to crush dissent and they have to crush other people's freedoms to keep that power. This is universal through human history. It's always going to be this way throughout human history, I think. How do you tell that part of the story that, hey, this isn't just some ideological term we throw around on social media? This is a part of the human experience for as long as we have recorded human history. And it's happening right now to real life people that through technology you can talk to, like Francis.
Yeah, absolutely. I think in addition to, the dissidents telling their personal stories, which is an incredibly important part of this, they also talk about the technical details of how these authoritarian governments begin, how they take over, how socialism leads to communism, the economic implications of these systems for the citizens of their home countries. And so it's not just that they're telling their personal stories, but they really are reaching back into history and talking about how these things happen, how people groups become oppressed, how countries fall into authoritarian rule.
And Francis, we know the history of how Hong Kong fell under authoritative rule. We know, it was British. Now the Chinese have control of it. What's the future? And I don't want to be bleak about it, but the Communist Chinese Party is very ingrained. They're not going anywhere anytime soon. What's the immediate future of Hong Kong? Are they going to get even more freedoms taken away? What's the status right now today? Because like we mentioned before, the Western media has kind of stopped covering it, unfortunately, since probably the 2019 where we had those visual things. What's been going on since then, and what do you anticipate in the near future?
Well, as I said, on a civil activity level, there's none. There's no protest going on in the streets. But then I also want to mention that I think there are still resistance among the people. You can't shut people's mouth like all of a sudden and erase their memories. I think that's something we can hold hope on. And when there is such a huge oppression that exists in the city, that's when arts start to evolve, and that's when creation starts to come out, and we see many people start to pay more attention to local arts and local music, and just everything that's coming out from Hong Kong, because they know that's what our national identity is contained to, and they start to embrace more about the local culture, and that's how they practice and how they really lift their identity out as a Hong Konger. So you see there are a lot of different art, different special, unique things that comes out from the city, and our part in Exile is to promote about it and to amplify that, because the people in Hong Kong, they do not get as much exposure and attention as they have before. And I think even now, like within arts, you can see people's voice they are continuing to speak up and to say the values they want to embrace. So when you look at little things and basically things that comes out from the city, it's just amazing. And I think that's the thing that we can look forward to. And who knows, like I think back in 2014, I didn't imagine that something as big as massive as the 2019 movement would happen. So perhaps we can have hope that in the future something like that could happen, even and something even bigger. We don't know. And I can only tell you that for people like us outside, we have the responsibility to amplify their voice and to continue to bring attention to them. And that's why I'm with the Dissident Project, because I want to tell a story of Hong Kong, basically.
Are you aware of that as you do your advocacy? And I know we're talking with Grace, the way you've built the Dissident Project, it's going to be very online. It's very multimedia. It's multi-platform, we call it, on purpose. Are you cognizant of that? It's like you don't really know what's going to break through, not just to Hong Kong, but the Chinese people themselves. I know they keep a real tight lock on the technology, but you never know what might get through. And you never know who might get to see it. And that little sliver, like for example, when Speaker Pelosi went to Taiwan and the CCP just absolutely freaked out, we kind of say it's like, it's not just that they're free. That scares them to death because somebody might see that and they might see somebody that's free and they might see a country that's free and something. Are you really cognizant of that? It's like every time I do this, every time I make a YouTube video, every time I do an interview, you just never know what might slide through and inspire that one more person.
Yeah. Absolutely. Like they would send millions of people online, like robots, to comment under a video and to basically create a huge backlash online against your video or anything that you do. And that's when this is something they care about and they're scared of. And so we would do that more. A lot of times sanctions does help. Sometimes when they're trying to do evil things and little things and they thought no one is going to pay attention to, and we reveal that truth, they are scared too. So we'll just continue to do that more often.
Yeah, I've had a few run-ins with those state-sponsored tag Twitter accounts once or twice because I don't care. I say what I think of them, and they know exactly where I stand on that. Grace, you have to know that, though, when you put this project together, they are the CP propaganda online. It's very active. There's a lot of bots out there. They have a lot of malicious stuff out there. You got to be aware of that when you put this project together. It's like, this isn't just going to be us talking to kids. This is a worldwide audience, and there's some really bad people just going to be watching us and not liking what we're doing too, right?
Oh, yeah. Yes, we're very aware. And I think being strategic with our language has been really important for us, not only as we consider those different factors, which are huge, and the safety of our dissidents, which is huge, but also reaching as many people as possible, right? We want to reach people in the movable middle. We want to talk about human rights abuses. We want to talk about liberty. We want to use language that will be as accessible as possible for as many people as possible. So we're being very cognizant of all of those different factors.
Yeah, it's a tough road to hoe because you want to say certain things to people that are just that out and out wicked, but at the same time, you got to understand there's another audience. So God bless you for walking that hard line. We're going to take one more quick break. We come back. We're going to kind of wrap this up a little bit more about the Dissident Project. We're going to talk about those kids they're going to be talking to in the schools, the reactions, what it's like to talk to them, what it brings up in the people that do it. Because sometimes we just see the people standing in front of the room and you need to know what it feels like to stand up there. I've had to do that a little bit myself sometimes. More with Grace, more with Francis, as we continue Heard Tell right after this. Welcome back to Heard Tell, talking to our good friends Grace and Francis, the Dissident Project. Francis, when you go to something like a school or even like a college or something like this, and you have that room full of people and they're just staring at you, you know you've got a message that matters. You know this is life and death stuff to the people of Hong Kong. What goes through your mind in that minute before you kind of get into your routine and the things you normally say, and you just got all those people staring at you, and do you feel the weight of it? Does it hit you like, oh, what am I doing here? This is not exactly what my life plan was.
Well, I would say all the activists or dissidents that come out from our country did not imagine that we're living the life that we're living right now. That's one thing. I have my own dream, and that's not something related to politics, obviously. And I didn't imagine myself would be standing in front of the classroom and talking to a bunch of students about Hong Kong. And but that's what I have to do, right? And so I remind myself what I'm here for, not just for my people. It's not like I am a great leader that it's like living a life against my will. It's really for myself and for people I care. And I have family and friends back home in Hong Kong, and those are the people that keep me fighting till now. So I just remind myself, like, this is what I'm here for, and I'm gonna do great. And if they're gonna stare at me continually, then I would be, I would just tell them, let's put yourself in my shoes and think about what it would be like to live a life that without freedom, a life that you would scare to death that one day the police are gonna knock on your door and take your parents away. That's it, and that's the life that many dissidents are living in, and people living under communist rule are facing. So once you tell that kind of scenario and that kind of story, you're going to capture their attention.
Yeah. I hate to correct guess. I rarely do it, but you're wrong, by the way. You are a great leader. Just so you know, and somebody tells you publicly. Great. Welcome back to Heard Tell. Okay, we got Daniel Chang Contreras. We're talking the immigrant. I don't even know what we need an overarching term for this, because we have the Martha Vineyard part, we got the bus part, we got the vice president house part, we got the New York part, the DC part. Isn't that part of the problem, though, is because this thing unthreads so many different ways, and the stunts become the thing, and then that's all anybody ever talks about. And now they're, here in another day or two, everybody will forget about it and move on. Like you said, though, this is a constant problem.
Yeah, it is. According to Border Patrol, 50,499 encounters were from Venezuelans in fiscal year 21, 155,553 this fiscal year, which hasn't ended. And we already have approximately 300,000 Venezuelans who have requested temporary protected status. It is an ongoing problem, and it's an ongoing problem that has been caused by the Venezuelan the political situation back home, back in Venezuela. This is something, by the way, which I think, Andrew, is really important to point out here. And one of the things that really concerns me is the way Republicans have been framing the issue of Venezuelans. Because, of course, since these stunts are made to highlight the problem of the border, which is a disaster, and of course to highlight hypocrisy of Democrat majors and all that, which I understand, it's a political ploy that's a fair many points. The problem here is that Republicans are now confounding the Venezuelan issue with illegal immigrants, right? After years of they saying, oh, the Venezuelan situation is so bad, communism is so bad, socialism is so bad, this is what socialism causes to a country, it destroys the country, and the Venezuelan people are now suffering from it. And that was all good or great, and actually was true and empathetic. And they somehow say the same thing about Cubans. Cubans are not refugees, are not illegal immigrants or refugees because they're escaping a communist dictatorship. Oh, but the Venezuelans who are also being ruled by a similar dictatorship, they are illegal immigrants just because, of course, the ploy requires them to be illegal immigrants, right? So that's what actually concerns me quite a lot, that the Republican Party, who has been quite consistent on the way that characterized the Venezuelan crisis, now in these moments, because, of course, the political necessities dictate in that way, they changed a little bit the tune. It's like, oh, Venezuelans are no longer like kind of victims of communism, another illegal immigrants are coming to the country. That's something that I consider it's worrisome as a Venezuelan and as a conservative as well.
Here's the thing. Let's be adults here. When whoever planned this and I know DeSantis and Governor Abbott and Governor DeSantis, they're getting the flack because these are their programs. They didn't handpick these folks. Somebody in their chain of command and their staffs did this. Somebody purposefully said, let's get the Venezuelans for this. They did that purposefully. They didn't get, folks from any other country. They didn't use Mexicans. They didn't use any other group. I know it's speculation. I don't think that's accidental. It can't be accidental of all the folks down there. They know the asylum process is more legally fraught. They know it's more complicated. They know that the situation of these folks is a little different. Why did they pick the Venezuelan folks for this, do you think? Because it's happened more than once now, so it's not accidental.
Yeah, it's happening a while. I mean, actually, the majority of people being bussed around, it's not like only Martha's Vineyard or the vice president's home. It's like majority of them are Venezuelans. I wouldn't know, as you said, it's speculative. I don't know the inner and outs and like the process it works, but my working theory is basically most Venezuelans who cross the border immediately ask for asylum. I mean, they cross the border and immediately ask for asylum because that's the way that migratory flow is working, right? So when you ask for asylum, of course, you have to report to government, basically, right? You have to report to border agents, you have to report to immigration officers in some ways. That makes the Venezuelan pool of migrants or refugees easier to detect, basically, than those from other countries that don't try to claim asylum and try to actually go into the country without being caught by immigration officers. That's what I think, first one. And the second one, of course, as you said, the situation is quite fraught. Venezuelans, we are very new at this, trying to get this, of crossing the border. This is not a history of Venezuelan crossing the U.S. border. So, of course, people who come here can be easily dissuaded to try to go and pick a bus. Maybe it works for them, actually. Maybe they want to go to New York, whatever. The situation is fraught. A lot of them probably don't know a lot of English. And, it's a bit easier to get them to agree. Probably a lot of them do agree and just want to go further north. And like they say, okay, I'll pick the free ride. So I think it's a combination of both factors. One, that the Venezuelan pool is easier to detect. That's my working theory. I don't know if it's true. I don't know if it's not true. It's just completely speculative. And the second one is, of course, the situation is a little bit more fraud. A lot of Venezuelans, it's the first time they do come to the United States. They don't have a lot of people who are trying to, it's just not a history, right, of Venezuelans trying to cross into the United States through the Rio Grande. So it's easier for them to believe anything, really, what they told.
The sad truth of this, Daniel Chang Contreras joining us. The sad truth of this is I think everybody got what they wanted out of this episode, the Martha's Vineyard episode. This Governor DeSantis, he got his national pub. The anti-immigration folks got to throw a big fit. The pro-immigration fans got to say, oh, look how well we treated these people before we, shipped them off to Cape Cod, which, by the way, that's been a refugee place for years and years and years. That's exactly where you put somebody like that. So that was all noise too, by the way. What do we do now? Because everybody got what they wanted out of this story, this is going to happen again. They're going to keep doing this. Everybody, both sides, they're going to keep doing this because everybody got what they wanted out of it. So what do we do next time? Because there's going to be a next time.
Well, that's something that really concerns me, is the fact that it will continue happening. Venezuelans are now part of the American political game, sometimes very political toxic game between Democrats and Republicans, and there will not be a policy. And that's something that I said in Twitter thread. It was in Spanish, but I'll try to translate it. The fact that this Martha's Vineyard episode, beside the hypocrisies of both parties and all that, shows that there is a lack of policy, a lack of coherent policy by the United States government to attend the biggest humanitarian crisis in the Western Hemisphere, and it will continue going on this way. You will see more buses being shipped to Washington, to New York, to other blue cities. Blue cities will, do a photo up and say we treated them well and they shipped them off. But the reality is that Venezuelans will still be the victims after this. I mean, the consequences of this is that Venezuelan asylum seekers there's not a policy to take care of the Venezuelan refugee problem. And now that it's become politicized, there's even less chances for there to be a coherent policy response to the Venezuelan refugee crisis. A crisis that, and I really want to really point this out again and again and again and again, is not a unique American situation. It has been going on in the entire continent for years. 6.8 million people in the last 4 to 5 years. That's a quarter of the population. That's like 80 to 90 million Americans left in 4 years. That's the situation. That's it is almost at the same size as the Ukrainian and Syrian refugee crisis without a war. That's the size of the problem we're talking about. America's only get the little bit of it 4 years later, and it caught the American government and the political establishment off guard.
Yeah. To put a bow on this, you tweeted about this extensively. I'm going to paraphrase and condense this because this Twitter thread was in Spanish and a lot of us don't habla. So you tell me if I'm wrong on any of this, but I'm going to try to paraphrase some of what you were getting to. And basically what you started driving at, because you started getting pushback on Twitter and you started responding to it. A lot of the same tropes we hear about the southern border is like, oh, well, Venezuelans, they're just sending us, they're emptying their prisons and sending us all their bad folks. And then you went, and this one really hit me because I think you're right. I think this is going to happen. I'm going to quote you here, and this is the Google Translate. So if it's a little off, you tell me. But it said, in 2 years, you're going to see Republicans. And again, they've always said these are communist refugees. We need to help these people. What's going on in Venezuela? Correctly, what's going on in Venezuela is a humanitarian tragedy. This was one of the richest nations in the world through natural resources and other ways, and they completely wrecked the economy in basically 1 decade. You said several Republicans, you're going to start seeing them say, well, Venezuela isn't really that bad, that it's been fixed. Why not just make them all go back? I'm afraid you're right, but I'm afraid you're right because we're starting to hear that about Cuba. We've started to hear that about other places that legal immigrants even come to. There's this real hardcore wing, and it's always been there. You can go back to the 1880s and see the exact same propaganda of, well, you're native born or you need to go back. That kind of garbage. I think you're right because we've seen this over and over again all throughout American history where you have this and again, I'm not talking about illegal immigration, which is a problem that needs to be dealt with. Legal immigration, asylum seekers, refugees that we probably should be doing some kind of accommodation for. I think you're right to say that. What are you watching for in the next, like we said, they're going to keep doing these events. What are you watching for in the next few years that are going to be warning signs that the tide like that is turning?
Well, I think one of the most important things to note will be the way and the narrative that turns that Republican and conservative media outlets use to describe the Venezuelan situation, right? Until now, until a couple months, it was always Venezuela was used as a talking point for campaign speech saying, this is what socialism does. It's really bad. People are fleeing for their lives or escaping a communist regime, which is all true. But if that tone, when they talk about Venezuela, changes from this is an example of what socialism can do to, oh, look, this is another example of what Biden failed immigration policy has done. And they're bringing criminals and all that. This Breitbart report that came out talking about that, which I think is really inconsistent and flimsy. If this is the new talking point when they talk about Venezuela, just the migratory issue, and completely forget the root cause of the problem, which is communism, socialism. If that's going on, then I'm afraid the Republican talking points and the Republican rhetoric on Venezuela will change drastically, and will go on, and they will just simply lump it in as if it was another immigration problem of, like, I don't know, Mexico and El Salvador or Guatemala or whatever.
Yeah, and this is a problem whether it's immigration, education, spending, whatever. When you start lumping things into buzzwords, you don't get any kind of good policy out of that because these things are complicated and you got to turn the noise down. That's why I have people like you on, my friend Daniel Chang Contreras, joining us. Till we get you back, I'm going to have you back because we're going to keep talking about this. This is going to continue to be an issue, unfortunately, for the Venezuelan people. Let folks know where they can follow you, what you got going on. We got your social media up on the screen. Let folks know what you got going on until they see you on Heard Tell again, my friend.
Yeah, you guys can follow me on Twitter. I usually post my thoughts over there, both in Spanish and English, and also write for El American, which is a conservative media outlet aimed at Hispanics. I occasionally write there, so anything that I post, I'll post it over there.
Great job, buddy. Good information. Love talking. Good time. We'll do it again real soon, sir. Thank you so much for the time.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you very much.
Yes, sir.
All the music on Heard Tell is provided under a Creative Content license from monstercat.com.